It's mine, huh? What's yours? What am I supposed to do here? Well, hi. I mean, hey y'all. I'm still working on how hey y'all feels. Welcome on in to the Kanga Casa, a place where we throw it back and talk webcomics, art advice, and fandom culture. I'm your scruffy, lovable host, Mark, and this is my rosy companion, Ike. Yes, we're two sides of the same coin, don't ask how it works. Also, hey, how about this new background? How did you get us up here? Up where? Well, judging by the comets flying by, I assume we're no longer on Earth? Ike, we're not even sentient creatures able to inhabit a physical realm. Oh, right. But then how... All right, let's hit it. Hey, you always do that. I'm guessing you're here because... you want to make webcomics? Well, I'd love to say been there, done that, but that's only partially true. You see, I'm admittedly new at the game myself. However, in January of last year, I decided to go out on a whim and just start making this thing that's been brewing in the back of my mind since 2020. And by thing, I mean it's an ongoing webcomic series that basically borders on light novel. Ramen Duke is the name. But I won't divulge any further details, at least not yet. I'm just so used to being as vague about this as possible when talking about it to others, as it's taken many twists and turns regarding what fashion I wanted to present the story in at the time. Whatever the case, I've been on quite the journey since day one. But honestly, it hasn't been some impossible mountain to climb. If anything, the biggest challenge has been the endurance aspect. But specifically, I want to disseminate some things that might be daunting to new comic artists, when, in reality, a lot of these that I'm about to bring up are merely suggestions, if not completely misconstrued details, that bear no real consequences from an industry standpoint. So, I'm sure you've gathered by now that this video is strictly geared towards making webcomics and not consuming them, but I just felt I had to get that out there. And if we're clearing up the air before we begin, I should also add that this should merely serve to inspire. What this isn't is an in-depth instructional guide, though stay tuned as I might decide to take you all with down that rabbit hole if you're interested. Ike, set the like goal to... 30? 30? I think half that. 20. Yeesh. Subscribers, where you at? Don't leave a boy hanging. I've decided this needs to be talked about first, as I have personal experience in stressing the heck out over measuring every line and every border just right in Clip Studio Paint so that nothing deviates from this make-believe formula in my mind. The margins in between panels had to be a perfect 10 pixels every time, and other adjacent details had to be measured in multiples of that amount. Things had to snap in place according to this frankly limiting grid pattern, which was like the biggest eyesore to stare at. And worst of all, moving into drawing, I had this ill-fated idea to use the exact same line weight no matter what I was working on. The idea being that this would speed things up and promote consistency, but, and maybe it's because I'm just not at that pro level yet, these early panels may have looked consistently terrible, that is, leading me to inevitably erasing and fixing everything, adding even more precious time. So yes, in my opinion, the only time you should really be concerned with measuring layout in webcomics is if you decide to make physical printed copies. Similarly, formulas aren't some ancient Masonic knowledge that every comic artist or ever was should abide by. A formula to me is any kind of written down or retained information used to help you keep a consistent workflow and visual balance page to page. They are meant to serve you as the artist and not to meet some industry expectations or whatever. So obviously, I wouldn't do away with formulas in comics, but it's definitely something you can get really bogged down in and overwhelmed by if you're not careful. Like, say you realized you accidentally merged your toning layer, that's the dotted comic look by the way, with your artwork layer, and the commonplace error only hits you after returning the next day. So it's not like you can undo a few times to fix it. Where I'm going at here is, what's stopping you from just drawing over all that? and the entire page for that matter. Lest we forget where we came from, that place being pen and paper, any of these digital hacks or advantages we have at our disposal can easily be overwritten at every stop and no one's gonna call you out. And I'm not trying to sound like a traditional purist. I'm simply urging you guys to remember that the comic making process throughout modern history has been very fluid and usually subjective to the artist's preferred vision. Now let's turn a corner and go over some principles that, in my eyes, are more cut and dry. I said this wasn't going to be a nitty-gritty how-to lesson in comics, but there really was no feasible way to get what I wanted said without spending a moment talking about some things that you should know in terms of structuring your scenes and pages. Number one would be panel ethics, or etiquette. Whichever makes me sound more like a snob. Depending on if you're planning to market your comic to a Western or Eastern audience, then there's little room to argue about how you should generally sequence each scene. I'm saying you should always think in terms of how your reader's eyes will track on a page. Trent Kanayuga, a massively successful comic artist, has a brilliant video that goes over why our brains are wired to read information in this way. But the takeaway is that you should always start from the top left and work your way down in a Z pattern. And for mangas, it's essentially the reverse of that. Of course, you do have to also take into account how busy your page will be. For example, the rule I just stated isn't as hard and fast the less panels you have on a page. I mean, a page with 2 panels can be structured however you want, as long as the second panel occurs to the right or below in some manner. Actually, let me revise that, as that's a rule I've been known to break. Let me explain. This arguably applies more to your speech bubble placements, but in some rare instances, you can get away with the actual panel progression being more loose and interpretive. Off the top of my head, I can think of a page where there's a central scene playing out, while something else is happening in the background. This simultaneous thing may be represented by another standalone panel, but the important thing to remember is that the dialogue and text should be read like a book so not to confuse the reader. This poses as kind of an unforeseen challenge to many new comic artists, as it results in you having to deeply consider where you might place your characters in a scene, and how changing that up will affect both continuity and readability. Okay, so I'm kind of bouncing from point to point. No rue pun intended. But since I've already mentioned dialogue, another important consideration on that front is spacing and timing. Essentially, I'm arguing you should allow room for the reader to make their own judgments based on the context they are presented with on the page, rather than flooding them with seas of narration and overly complex dialogue. One of the many pitfalls I've noticed in even some established comic artists is that some of the dialogue feels suspiciously on the nose, as if they're no longer communicating with another character in the shared universe, and instead with you, the audience. Of course, this is another thing I can see done cleverly, but there's a time and a place. You'll hear me repeat that phrase a lot, I'm sure. So now, maybe you're already set with how a general page out of your comic should look like, depending on how you've gone about applying this information. But you're probably also wondering, okay, but does this stuff automatically speak for every genre of comic? And my answer would be, for the most part, yeah. But you bring up a great point. Genres in comics do tend to switch up the game quite a bit. With the advent of image-sharing social media platforms, 4-panel comics, as an example, have kind of dominated the scene. The 4-panel format is particularly keen at presenting an easily digestible joke, because of the way artists utilize the space to set up a narrative and deliver a punchline. These are basically the offspring of the classic newspaper comic strips. When expanding outward from 4 panels to 6, or 8, or 10, then things start to get kind of interesting. You might still find humorous comics in this range, and I bet the majority of those still like to maintain size consistency in the panels, but this is where more plot-driven comics shine, especially when they think bigger picture or outside the box. And I mean both figuratively and literally. Ultimately, I wouldn't put too much thought into this particular notion for reasons that I think trump what webcomics are all about. In my opinion, the sky's the limit in this medium, but just remember not to alienate your audience. Or in other words, don't venture too far out of this world. it's important to have in mind before you get going that actually making the comic is only part of the process. Of course, publishing is its own beast, but one of the more silent contenders is branding. Luckily, if this isn't your area of expertise, there are plenty of freelance graphic artists who are willing to work with you to get these elements made. I'm talking banners, icons, covers / thumbnails, watermarks, fonts, character lineups, among other things. Though whatever supporting material I didn't just mention, I don't consider it quite as important to the average webcomic campaign, unless future me has something else to interject with right here. No? Okay, sweet. Of course, branding is also the act of how you market your comic as well. Many comic artists choose to launch a Kickstarter campaign to fund the actual production of their comic. The most preferred window of opportunity for this presents itself once you are mostly, if not already finished with a major release. If you're sneaky, you can incentivize readers to act on these by already giving them a taste of your comic. I know personally speaking, this is how my brain operates when I'm looking for new titles. I mean, I have to see what something is about, and if it looks half decent. And the way to go about this is through clever uses of branding. The hookier, the better. And oftentimes, readers won't know what they're looking for. So if you know you've got an interesting story or style, use it in how you decide to market yourself and your comic. My hope is that by knocking out and addressing all these typical tasks that fall in the hands of fresh new webcomic artists, your load will feel lighter now that I've disclosed most, if not all, the tough details in one fell swoop. That's giving myself too much credit though, I'm afraid. Like, I forget that Webtoon is a thing, and I'll go mask off for a minute. The world of Webtoon and other similar manga-centric apps is pretty alien to me. But I do know that most of what I've already covered isn't going to resonate the best with that audience, and most certainly all this branding jargon, because Webtoon is what I would call an SEO-driven social media platform, wherein user search terms do most of the heavy lifting when it comes to discovering new titles. This is why you'll often find titles that so obviously express what the supporting material is about. Take Trapped in a Soap Opera, for example, or My Virtual God is a Teenage Girl. And then you have the countless titles that aren't exactly to the point, but are so incomprehensibly basic that you're bound to come across them by accident with minimal effort. It's mine, huh? What's yours? What am I supposed to do here? Anyways, I'll be done flaming what is ultimately a perfectly viable career platform for aspiring webcomic artists. Also, I took a quick look at these fellas behind these aforementioned works. They're fairly respected, numbers-wise, so yeah, I'll shut up now. Future Mark here. While editing this, it has come to my attention that Webtoon is a lot more predacious than I think I let on. This update right here highlights just how strict and gatekeeping their grapple on new artists is. If you're unfamiliar with the process of publishing, Webtoon is definitely not a shining example of what kind of business relationship you should strive for. They are on a fast track to only monetizing and promoting works from established creators, mirroring what we've basically been seeing happen to most streaming platforms since their inception. So just be warned, Webtoon is not the be-all end-all. Now, if you got the timing of everything else in the bag, and you're ready to get some, if not all, your work published, then pay close attention. Notice how I said some? Well, this may come as a surprise, it may not. But one of the more popular methods of releasing a webcomic is not all at once, but rather in an episodal sort of way. Hiveworks, for example, my favorite indie publisher, thrives off of doing this. It's sort of like a streaming service. What you'd do in this situation is you'd pitch them your first complete chapter or part of your comic, just whatever you have complete. Then they contractualize your release schedule to make sure you are consistent and, don't dip out immediately after landing a deal. And, well, yeah, if you're able to form a good work relationship with your publishers, then that, in turn, benefits them as much as you. And this puts into perspective exactly the point I'm trying to make, in that working with publishers isn't always a trialless and thankless journey of self-disinterest. While some publishers out there, mainly the more well-established ones like Image or Dark Horse, may have a rigorous routine when it comes to micromanaging your output, a lot of the indie publishers I have researched are much less concerned with also acting as your editors, commanding you give up your artistic liberties for a fraction of the profit. This is why you'll find a wide breadth of works ranging in style and technique on these platforms, or wherever the works get distributed. Some indie publishers prefer a more samey style across their catalog. I'm looking at you guys over there at Silver Sprocket, but I know plenty others prefer a business model that values uniqueness at their center. Step 1 in landing a publishing deal is almost always reaching out, whether through an email, DM, or even just a comment on a social media post. Sometimes you will have to be politely persistent in the way you go about this, because these guys, they're busy. We all are. So on that note, I'd also exercise patience. Now, say you're watching this and you're looking to get started on this absolute behemoth of a concept for an ongoing life project. Let's say you're also like me, in other words. Now, I wouldn't be the first to tell you that you shouldn't feel held back from pursuing something like that, but I also wouldn't be the first to recommend, if it's in your interest, kicking off your webcomic journey with something a bit smaller in scale first. I say this because I believe that hands-on experience may be the best way to hammer these points and many others home. And in my opinion, it's better to do so with a project that isn't shooting for the stars or anything. I'd still recommend getting pretty invested in what this smaller project might be. For instance, the characters don't all have to be throwaways, no. The goal is to become familiar with not only the comic making process, but with how others might take upon a fully fledged out work in this vein. If you're successful, then I say go for the other thing. But it's important to remember that many of the most beloved storytellers of generations past and present didn't embark on their magnum opus until much later in their careers. Sometimes much, much later. And you really shouldn't be stressing yourself out too much about using this first chapter of your webcomic career, if that's what it so happens to be, to basically experiment to your heart's content. In conclusion, that always feels like a cop-out to say. If you can structure your pages to look as confident as this, and if you can market your webcomic to appear as attention-grabby as that, then it doesn't necessarily matter how you get there. But don't get duped into believing that the continued pursuit of webcomics is a walk in the park. The webcomics market is flooded to the brim with content, both good and bad. It is pivotal that you get out there and consume other fellow artists' works in order to get a better holistic view of what makes and breaks a comic better than anything I can offer you in these short 20-some-odd minutes. With that being said, I hope you are now, or still are, inspired to actually go for it and design a webcomic. The general process is pretty deceptively simple. Whatever method you use to tell a story, as long as it can convey the passing of a moment within a scene or scenes, and it's translated well for your average reader to understand, you've basically done it. You can slap that badge on and call yourself a bona fide comic artist. Now it's up to you where you decide to take that knowledge. Alright, I'll let you off the hook, but first, plugs. You can find me on Kara at MarsKidArt. My business email is marskid.art@gmail.com. I'm open for video editing if you like what I've done here. And for less formal inquiries, my Telegram is at marskid_art. And with that, big cheers. I'll catch you legends on another day. Gotta bounce.